Shall we start? I am Lady Rain, and this is the Reader's Nook, and we are on Chapter 9, Part 1, Chapter 9. There are 3 parts in this, I found. Thank goodness, I thought this was like long chapters up to Chapter 10. Each of them looks like they're about 10 chapters each, so by the way it looks, we have like 21 chapters left. We'll see how that goes. I know some of them get to like 40 parts, because there's different parts of each chapter. That's kind of neat. But yeah, we are going to start. Chapter 9, Part 1, Chapter 9. Anderson spins a tale. Part 1. Bobbi was getting off the couch slowly, wincing like an old woman. Bobbi, Gardner began. Christ, I ache all over, Anderson said, and I've got to change my never mind. How long did I sleep? Gardner glanced at his watch. 14 hours, I guess. A little more. Bobbi, your new book. Yeah, hold that until I get back. She walked slowly across the floor toward the bathroom, unbuttoning the shirt she'd slept in. And as she hobbled toward the bathroom, Gardner got a good look. A better one than he wanted, actually. Of just how much weight Bobbi had lost. This went beyond scrawniness to the point of emaciation. She stopped, as if aware Gardner was looking at her. And without looking around, she said, I can explain everything, you know. Can you? Gardner asked. Part 2. Anderson was in the bathroom a long time, much longer than it should have taken her to use the toilet and change her pad. Gardner was pretty sure that was what she gone to do. Her face just had that I got the curse look. He listened for the shower, but it wasn't running. And he began to feel uneasy. Bobbi had seemed perfectly lucid when she woke up. But did that necessarily mean she was? Gardner began to have uncomfortable visions of Bobbi wriggling out of the bathroom window and then running off into the woods in nothing but blue jeans, cackling wildly. He put his right hand to the left side of his forehead, where the scar was. His head had started to throb a little. He let another minute or two slip by and then got up and walked toward the bathroom, making an effort to step quietly. It was not quite unconscious. Visions of Bobbi escaping through the bathroom window to avoid explanations had been replaced by one of Bobbi serenely cutting her throat with one of Guard's own razor blades to avoid explanations permanently. He decided he would just listen. If he heard normal-sounding movements, he would go out to the kitchen and put on coffee, maybe scramble a few eggs. If he didn't hear anything, his words were needless. The bathroom door hadn't latched when she closed it. And other improvements aside, the unlatched doors in the place apparently still had their old way of swinging open. She'd probably have to shim up the whole north side of the house to do that. Maybe that was next week's project, he thought. The door had swung open enough for him to see Bobbi standing in the mirror where Gardner had stood himself not long ago. She had her toothbrush in one hand and a tube of toothpaste in the other, but she hadn't uncapped the tube yet. She was looking in the mirror with an intensity that was almost hypnotic. Her lips were pulled back, her teeth bared. She caught movement in the mirror and turned around, making no particular effort to cover her wasted breasts. Guard, do my teeth look all right to you? Guard looked at them. They looked at him about as they always had, although he couldn't remember ever having seen quite this much of them. He was reminded of that terrible photo of Karen Carpenter again. Sure. He kept trying not to look at her stacked ribs, painful jet, her pelvic bones above the waist of her jeans, which were drooping in spite of the belt clinched so tight it looked like a hobo's length of clothesline. I guess so, he smiled cautiously. Look, Ma, no cavities. Anderson tried to return Gardner's smile with her lips still pulled back to her gums. The result of this experiment was mildly grotesque. She put a forefinger to a molar and pressed. Does it wiggle and I oot at? What? Does it wiggle when I do that? No, not that I can see anyway. Why? It's just this dream I keep having. She looked down at herself. Get out of here, Guard. I'm in this hillbilly. Billy, is what she said. Don't worry, Bobbi. I wasn't going to jump your bones. Mostly because they'd be too close to what I'd really be doing. I'd be too close to what I'd really be doing. Sorry, he said. Door was open. I thought you'd gone out. He closed the door, latching it firmly. Through it, she said clearly, I know what you're wondering. He said nothing, only stood there. But he had a feeling she knew he was still there, as if she could see through the door. You're wondering if I'm losing my mind. No, he said then. No, Bobbi, but I'm as sane as you are, Anderson said through the door. I'm so stiff I can hardly walk, and I've got an ace bandage wrapped around my right knee for some reason. I can't quite remember, and I'm hungry as a bear, and I know I've lost too much weight. But I am sane, guard. I think you may have times before the day's over when you wonder if you are. The answer is, we both are. Bobbi, what's happening here? Gardner asked. It came out in a helpless sort of cry. I want to unwrap the goddamn ace bandage and see what's under it, Anderson said through the door. Feels like I jobbed my knee pretty good. Out in the woods, probably. Then I want to take a hot shower and put on some clean clothes. While I do that, you can make us some breakfast, and I'll tell you everything. Will you? Yes. Okay, Bobbi. I'm glad to have you here, guard, he said. I had a bad feeling once or twice, like maybe you weren't doing so good. Gardner felt his vision double, treble, and float away in prisms. He wiped his arm across his face. No pain, no strain, he said. I'll make some breakfast. Thanks, guard. He walked away, but he had to walk slow, because no matter how often he wiped his eyes, his vision kept trying to break up on him. Part 3. He stopped just inside the kitchen, went back to the closed bathroom door as a new thought occurred to him. Water was running in there now. Where's Peter? What? She called from the drumming shower. I said, where's Peter? He called, raising his voice. Dead, Bobbi called back over the drumming water. I cried, guard. But he was, old, Gardner muttered. He remembered and raised his voice again. It was old age then? Yes, Anderson called back over the drumming water. Guard stood there for a moment before going back to the kitchen, wondering why he believed Bobbi was lying about Peter and how he had died. Part 4. Guard scrambled eggs and fried bacon on Bobbi's grill. He noticed that a microwave oven had been installed over the conventional one since he'd last been here. And there was now track lighting over the main work areas and the kitchen table, where Bobbi was in the habit of eating most of her meals, usually with a book in her free hand. He made coffee, strong and black, and was just bringing everything to the table when Bobbi came in, wearing a fresh pair of cords and a t-shirt with a picture of a black fly on it, and the legend, Maine State Bird. Her wet hair was wrapped in a towel. Anderson surveyed the table. No toast? She asked. Make your own friggin' toast, Anderson said amiably. I didn't hitchhike 200 miles to buddle your breakfast. Anderson stared. You did what? Yesterday. In the rain? Yeah. What in God's name happened? Muriel said you were doing a reading tour, and your last one was June 30th. You called Muriel? He said absurdly touched. When? Anderson flapped a hand as if it didn't matter. Probably it didn't. What happened? She asked again. Gardner thought about telling her, wanted to tell her, he realized, dismayed. Was that what Bobbi was for, then? Was Bobbi Anderson really no more than a wall he wailed to? He hesitated, wanting to tell her, and didn't. There would be time for that later. Maybe. Later, he said, I want to know what happened here. Breakfast first, Anderson said. And that's in order. 5. Guard gave Bobbi most of the eggs and bacon, and Bobbi didn't waste time. She went to them like a woman who hadn't eaten, well, for a long time. Okay, why is this beeping in my butt? There we go. If it doesn't stand right, it doesn't work. And that's a nice thing, because then it can't catch fire. She went to them like a woman who hadn't eaten well for a long time. Watching her eat, Gardner remembered a biography of Thomas Edison. he had read when he was quite young, no more than 10 or 11. Edison had gone on wild work jags in which idea had followed idea, invention followed invention. During these spurts, he had ignored wife, children, baths, even food. If his wife hadn't brought him his meals on a tray, the man might literally have starved to death between the light bulb and the phonograph. There had been a picture of him, hands plunged into hair that was wildly awry, as if it had been actually trying to get at the brain beneath hair and skull. The brain which would not let him rest. Gardner remembered thinking that the man looked quite insane, and he thought, touching the left side of his forehead, Anderson had been subject to migraines and deep depressions. He saw no sign of depression in Bobbi, however. She gobbled eggs, ate 7 or 8 slices of bacon wrapped in a slice of toast, slathered with oleo, and swallowed 2 large glasses of orange juice. When she had finished, she uttered a resounding belch. Gross, Bobbi! In Portugal, a good belch is considered a compliment to the cook. What do they do after they get laid? After a good lay? Fart? Anderson threw her head back and roared with laughter. The towel fell from her hair, and all at once Gard wanted to take her to bed, bag of bones or not. Smiling a little, Gardner said, "Okay, it was good. Thanks. Some Sunday I'll make you some swell eggs Benedict. Now give." Anderson reached behind him and brought down a half-full package of Camels. She lit one and pushed the pack toward Gardner. "No thanks. It's the only bad habit I ever succeeded in mostly giving up." But before Bobbi was done, Gardner had smoked 4 of them. 6. "You looked around," Anderson said. "I remember telling you to do that, just barely. And I know you did. You look like I felt after I found the thing in the woods." "What thing?" "If I told you now, you'd think I was crazy. Later on, I'll show you. But right now, I think we'd better just talk. Tell me what you saw around the place, what changes." So Gardner ticked them off. Cellar improvements, the litter of projects, the weird little sun in the water heater, the strange job of customizing on the Tomcat's engine. He hesitated for a moment, thinking of the addition to the shifting diagram, and let that go. He supposed Bobbi knew he had seen it anyway. And somewhere in the middle of all that, he said, "You found time to write another book. A long one. I read the first 40 pages or so while I was waiting for you to wake up. And I think it's as good as long. It's as good as well as long. The best novel you've ever written, probably. And you've written some good ones." Anderson was not unpleased. "Thank you. I think so, too." She pointed to the last slice of bacon on the platter. "You want that?" "No." "Sure?" "Yes." She took it and made it gone. "How long did it take you to write?" "I'm not completely sure," Anderson said. "Maybe 3 days. No more than a week, anyway. Did most of it in my sleep." Gard smiled. "I'm not joking, you know," Anderson smiled. Gard stopped smiling. "My time sense is pretty fucked up," she admitted. "I do know I wasn't working on it the 27th. That's the day when time, sequential time, seemed completely clear to me. You got here last night, July 4th, and it was done. So, a week max? But I really don't think it was more than 3 days." Gard gaped. Anderson looked back calmly, wiped her fingers on the napkin. "Bobbi, that's impossible," Gardner said finally. "If you think so, you missed my typewriter." Gardner had glanced at Bobbi's old machine when he sat down, but that was all. His attention had been riveted immediately by the manuscript. He had seen the old black Underwood thousands of times. The manuscript, on the other hand, was new. If you'd looked closely, you would have seen the roll of computer paper on the wall behind it, and another of those gadgets behind it. Egg crate, heavy-duty batteries and all. "What, these?" She pushed the cigarettes across to Gardner, who took one. "I don't know how it works, but then, I don't really know how any of them work. Including the one that's running all the juice in this place." She smiled at Gardner's expression. "I'm off the central main power tit, Gard. I had them interrupt service. That's how they put it. As if they know damned well you'll want it back before too long. See, 4 days ago, that I do remember. Bobby, there's a gadget like the thing in the water heater and the one behind my typewriter in the junction box out back. Only that one's the granddaddy of them all, Anderson laughed. The laugh of a woman in the grip of pleasant reminiscences. There's 20 or 30 D cells in that one. I think Polly Andrews down at Cooter's Market thinks I've gone nuts. I bought every battery she had in stock, and then I went to Augusta for more. Was that the day I got the dirt from that I got the dirt from the cellar? She addressed that last to herself, frowning. Then her face cleared. I think so, yeah. The historic battery run of 1988. Hit about 7 different stores, came back with hundreds of batteries. And then I stopped in Albion and got a truckload of loam to sweeten the cellar. I'm almost positive I did both things the same day. The troubled frown resurfaced, and for a moment Gardner thought Bobbi looked scared and exhausted again. Of course, she was still exhausted. Exhaustion of the sort Gardner had seen last night went bone deep. A single night's sleep, no matter how long and deep, wouldn't erase it. And then there was this wild, hallucinatory talk. Books written in her sleep, all the AC current in the house, being done by D cells, run to Augusta on crazy errands. Except that the proof was here, all around him. He had seen it. That one, Anderson said, and laughed. What, Bobbi? I said I had a devil of a job setting up the one that generates the juice here in the house and out at the dig. What dig? Is that the thing in the woods you want to show me? Yes, soon. Just give me a few minutes. Anderson's face again assumed that look of pleasure in telling, and Gardner suddenly thought it must be the expression on the faces of all those who have tales they don't just want to tell, but tales they must tell. From the lecture hall, or who was part of an Antarctic expedition in 1937, and who still had his fading slides to prove it. To Ishmael the sailor man, late of the ill-fated quote, who finishes his tale with a sentence that seems a desperate cry only thinly and perfunctorily disguised as information. Only I am left to tell you. Was it desperation and madness that Gardner detected beneath Bobbi's cheerful, disjointed remembrances of 10 wacky days in Haven? Gardner thought so. Knew so. Who was better equipped to see signs? Whatever Bobbi had faced here while Gardner was reading poetry to overweight matrons and their bored husbands, it had nearly broken her mind. Anderson lit another cigarette with a hand that trembled slightly, making the match flame quiver momentarily. It was the sort of thing you would have seen only if you were looking for it. I was out of egg cartons by then, and the thing was going to have too many batteries for just 1 or 2 anyway. So I got one of old Frank's cigar boxes. There must be a dozen old wooden ones in the attic, probably even Mabel Noyes down at Juncatorium. Juncatorium, would pay a few bucks for them. And you know what a skinflint she is. And I stuffed them with toilet paper and tried to make nests in the paper for the batteries to stand up in. You know, nests. Anderson made quick poking gestures with her right index finger and then looked bright-eyed at Gard to see if he got it. Gardner nodded. That feeling of unreality was stealing back. That feeling of his mind getting ready to seep through the top of his skull and float up to the ceiling. A drunk would fix that. A drunk would fix that, he thought, and the pulse in his head sharpened. But the batteries kept falling over anyway. She snuffed her cigarette and immediately lit another one. They were wild, just wild. I was wild too. Then I got an idea. I went down to Chip McCausland's, down on the dugout road. On the dugout road? Gardner shook his head. He had never been down the dugout road. Well, he lives out there with this woman. She's his common law wife, I guess, and about 10 kids. Man, you talk about sluts. The dirt on her neck guard. You couldn't wash it off unless you used a jackhammer on it first. I guess she was married before. Doesn't matter. It's just I haven't had anyone to talk to. I mean, they don't talk. Not the way a couple of people do. And they keep mixing up the stuff that's not important with the stuff that is. Anderson's words had started to come out quicker and quicker. Until now, they were almost tripping over each other. She's speed rapping, Gardner thought, with some alarm, and pretty soon she's going to start either yelling or crying. He didn't know which he dreaded more, and thought again of Ishmael. Ishmael rambling through the streets of Bedford, Massachusetts, stinking more of madness than whale oil, finally grabbing some unlucky passerby and screaming, "Listen, I'm the only fucking one left to tell you. So you better listen, damn you. You better listen if you don't want to be using this harpoon for a fucking suppository. I got a tale to tell. It's about this white fucking whale, and you're going to listen." He reached across the table and touched her hand. "You tell it any old way you want to. I'm here, and I'm going to listen. We've got time. Like you said, it's your day off, so slow down. If I fall asleep, you'll know you got too far from the point, okay?" Anderson smiled and relaxed visibly. Gardner wanted to ask again what was going on in the woods. More than that, who they were. But it would be best to wait. All bad things to come to him who waits, he thought, and after a pause to collect herself, Bobbi went on. "Chip McCausland's got 3 or 4 hen houses. That's all I started to say. For a couple of bucks, I was able to get all the egg cartons I wanted, even a few of the big egg crate sheets. These sheets each have 10 dozen cradles." Anderson laughed cheerfully and added something that brought goose flesh out of Gardner's skin. "Haven't used one of those yet, but when I do, I guess we'll have enough zap for the whole town of Haven to let go of the CMP tit, with enough left over for Albion and most of Troy as well. So I got the power going here. Jesus, I'm rambling. And I already had the gadget hooked up to the typewriter. And I really did sleep. Napped anyway. And that's about where we came in, isn't it?" Gardner nodded, still trying to cope with the idea that there might be fact as well as hallucination in Bobbi's casual statement that she could build a gadget which could power 3 small towns from a source consisting of 120 D-cell batteries. "What the gadget on the typewriter does is," Anderson frowned, her head cocked a little, as if she was listening to a voice Gardner could not hear. "It might be easier to show you. Go over there and roll in a sheet of paper, would you?" "Okay." He headed for the door into the living room, then looked back at Anderson. "Are you coming? Or aren't you coming?" Bobbi smiled. "I'll stay here," she said. And then Gardner got it. He got it and even understood on some mental level where only pure logic was allowed that it might be so. Hadn't the immortal Holmes himself said that when you eliminated the impossible, you have to believe whatever was left, no matter how improbable? And there was a new novel sitting in there on the table by what Bobbi sometimes called her word accordion. "Yeah, except typewriters don't write books by themselves, Gard, old buddy. You know what the immortal Holmes probably would say? That the fact that there is a novel sitting next to Bobbi's typewriter, and the added fact that this is a novel you never saw before, does not mean it is a new novel. Holmes would say Bobbi wrote that book at some time in the past. Then, while you were gone, Bobbi was losing her marbles. She brought it out and set it beside the typewriter. She may believe what she's telling you, but that doesn't make it so." Gardner walked into the cluttered corner of the living room that served as Bobbi's writing quarters. It was handy enough for the bookshelf, so she could simply rock back on the legs of her chair and grab almost anything she wanted. It was too good to be a trunk novel. He knew what the immortal Holmes would say about that, too. He would agree that The Buffalo Soldiers being a trunk novel was improbable. He would argue, however, that writing a novel in 3 days, and not at a typewriter, but while taking cat naps between repeated frenzies of activity, was imfucking-possible. Except that novel hadn't come out of any trunk. Gardner knew it, because he knew Bobbi. Bobbi would have been just as incapable of sticking a novel that good in her trunk as Gard was of remaining rational in a discussion on the subject of nuclear power. Fuck you, Sherlock. And the hansom cab you and Dr. W. rode in on. Christ, I want a drink. The urge, the need to drink, came back in full, frightening force. You there, Gard? Anderson called. Yes. This time he consciously saw the roll of computer paper. It hung down loosely. He looked behind the typewriter and did indeed see another of Bobbi's gadgets. This one was smaller, half an egg carton, with the last 2 egg cradles standing empty. These cells stood in the other 4, each neatly capped with one of those little funnels. Looking at them more closely, Gard decided they were scraps of tin can, carefully cut to shape with tin snips, each with a wire coming out of the funnel over the plus post, one red, one blue, one yellow, one green. These went to another circuit board. This one, which looked as if it might have come from a radio, was held vertically by 2 short, flat pieces of wood that had been glued to the desk, with the board sandwiched in between. These pieces of wood, each looking a little like a chalk gutter at the foot of the chalkboard, were so absurdly familiar to Gardner that for a moment he was unable to identify them. Then it came. They were the till holders you put your letters on when you were playing Scrabble. One single wire, almost as thick as an AC cord, ran from the circuit board into the typewriter. Put in some paper, Anderson called. She laughed. That was the part I almost forgot. Isn't that stupid? They were no help there, and I almost went crazy before I saw the answer. I was sitting on the jakes one day, wishing I'd gotten one of those damned word crunchers after all. When I reached for the toilet paper, Eureka! Boy, did I feel dumb. Just roll it in, Gard. No, I'm getting out of here right now, and then I'm going to hitch a ride up to Purple Cow in Hampton and get so fucking drunk I'll never remember this stuff. I don't ever want to know who they are. Instead, he pulled on the roll, slipped the perforated end of the first sheet under the roller, and turned the knob on the side of the old machine until he could snap the bar down. His heart was beating hard and fast. Okay, he called. Do you want me to turn something on? He didn't see any switch, and even if he had, he wouldn't have wanted to touch it. Don't need to, she called back. Gard heard a click. It was followed by a hum, the sound of a kid's electric train transformer. Green light began to spill out of Anderson's typewriter. Gardner took an involuntary scrambling step backwards on legs that felt like stilts. The light rayed out between the keys in weird, diverging strokes. There were glass panels set into the underwood's sides, and now they glowed like the walls of an aquarium. Suddenly, the keys of the typewriter began to depress themselves, moving up and down like the keys of a player piano. The cartridge moved rapidly, and letters spilled from the page. Full fathom 5, my father lies. Ding, bang. The cartridge returned. No, I'm not seeing this. I don't believe I'm seeing this. These are the pearls that were his eyes. Sickly green light spilling up through the keyboard and over the words like radium. Ding, bang. My beer is Rheingold, the dry beer. The line appeared in the space of the second. In the space of the second, it seemed. The keys were a humming blur of speed. It was like watching a news ticker. Think of Rheingold whenever you buy beer. Dear God, is she really doing this? Or is it a trick? With his mind tottering again in the face of this new wonder, he found himself grasping eagerly for Sherlock Holmes. A trick. Of course it was a trick. All a part of poor old Bobby's nervous breakdown. Her very creative nervous breakdown. Ding bang. Cartridge shot back. No trick, guard. The cartridge returned, and the humming keys typed this before his wide, staring eyes. You never were the first time. You were right the first time. I'm doing it from the kitchen. The gadget behind the typewriter is thought sensitive, the way a photoelectric cell is light sensitive. This thing seems to pick up my thoughts clearly to a distance of 5 miles. If I'm further away than that, things start to get jarbled. Beyond 10 or so, it doesn't work at all. Ding bang. The big silver lever to the left of the cartridge worked itself twice, cranked the paper, which now held 3 perfectly typed messages, up a few lines, then it resumed. So you see, I didn't have to be sitting at the typewriter to work on my novel. Look, Ma, no hands. This poor old Underwood ran like a bastard for those 2 or 3 days, guard, and all the time it was running, I was in the woods working around the place or down cellar. But as I say, mostly I was sleeping. It's funny. Even if someone could have convinced me such a gadget existed, I wouldn't have believed it would work for me. Because I've always been lousy at dictating. I've had to write my own letters. I always said, because I have to see the words on paper. It was impossible for me to imagine how someone could dictate a whole novel into a tape recorder, for instance, although some writers apparently do just that. But this isn't like dictating, guard. It's like a direct tap into the subconsciousness, more like dreaming than writing. But what comes out is unlike dreams, which are often surreal and disconnected. This really isn't a typewriter at all anymore. It's a dream machine, one that dreams rationally. There's something cosmically funny about them giving it to me so I could write The Buffalo Soldiers. You're right. It really is the best thing I've ever written. But it's still your basic haute opera. It's like inventing a perpetual motion machine so your little kid won't pester you anymore about changing the batteries in his toy car. But can you imagine what the results might have been if F. Scott Fitzgerald had had one of these gadgets, or Hemingway, Faulkner, Salinger? After each question mark, the typewriter fell momentarily silent and then burst out with another name. After Salinger's, it stopped completely. Gardner had read the material as it came out, but in a mechanical, almost uncomprehending way. His eyes went back to the beginning of the passage. I was thinking that it was a trick, that she might have hooked the typewriter up somehow, to write those 2 little snatches of verse. And it wrote. It had written, "No trick, guard." He thought suddenly, "Can you read my mind, Bobby?" Ding bang! The cartridge returned suddenly, making him jump and almost cry out. Yes, but only a little. What did we do on the 4th of July, the year I quit teaching? Drove up to Derry. You said you knew a guy who'd sell us some cherry bombs. He sold us the cherry bombs, but they were all duds. You were pretty drunk. You wanted to go back and knock his block off. I couldn't talk you out of it, so we went back. And damned if his house wasn't on fire. He had a lot of real stuff in the basement, and he dropped a cigarette butt into a box of it. You saw the fire and the fire trucks and got laughing so hard you fell down in the street. That feeling of unreality had never been so strong as it was now. He fought it, keeping it at arm's length, while his eyes searched through the previous passages for something else. After a second or two, he found it. There's something almost cosmically funny about them giving it to me, you know. And earlier, Bobby had said The batteries kept falling over, and they were wild, just wild. His cheeks felt hotly flushed, as if with fever, but his forehead felt as cold as an ice pack. Even the steady pulse of pain from above his left eye seemed cold. Shallow stabs hitting the metronome-like regularity, or with metronome-like regularity. Jeez, oh man. Ugh. Shallow stabs hitting with metronome-like regularity. Now I can read. Looking at the typewriter, which was filled with that somehow ghastly green light, Gardner thought, Bobbi, who are they? Ding, bang. The keys rattled off a burst, letters forming words, the words forming a child's couplet. Late last night and the night before, Tommyknockers knocking at the door. Jim Gardner screamed. 7. At last his hands stopped shaking, enough so he could get the hot coffee to his mouth without slopping it all over himself, thus finishing the morning's lunatic festivities with a few more burns. Anderson kept watching him from the other side of the kitchen table with concerned eyes. She kept a bottle of very good brandy in the darkest depths of the pantry, far away from the alcoholic staples, and she had offered to spike Guard's coffee with a wallop of it. He had declined, not just with regret, but with real pain. He needed that brandy. It would dull the ache in his head, maybe kill it entirely. More important, it would bring his mind back into focus. It would get rid of the I just sailed off the edge of the world feeling. The problem was, he'd finally gotten to that point, hadn't he? Correct. The point where it wouldn't stop with a single wallop of brandy in his coffee. There had been entirely too much input since he had opened the hatch at the bottom of Bobbi's water heater, and then gone upstairs for a belt of whiskey. It had been safe then. Now the air was the unsteady sort that spawned tornadoes. So, no more drinks. Not so much as an Irish sweetener in his coffee, until he understood what was happening here, including what was happening to Bobbi. That, most of all. I'm sorry that last bit happened, Anderson said, but I'm not sure I could have stopped it. I told you it was a dream machine. It's also a subconscious machine. I'm really not getting much of your thoughts at all, Guard. I've tried this with other people, and in most cases, it's as easy as sinking your thumb into fresh dough. You can core all the way to what I guess you'd call the id. Although it's awful down there, full of the most monstrous. You can't even call them ideas, images, I guess you'd say. Simple as a child's scrawl, but they're alive. Like those fish they find deep down in the ocean, the ones that explode if you bring them up. Bobbi suddenly shuddered. They're alive, she repeated. For a second there was no sound but the birds singing outside. Anyway, all I get from you is surface stuff, and most of that is all broken up and jarbled. If you were like anyone else, I'd know what's been going on with you, and why you look so crappy. Thanks, Bobbi. I know there was a reason. I kept coming here. And since it's not the cooking, it must be the flattery. He grinned, but it was a nervous grin, and he lit another cigarette. As it is, Bobbi went on as if he hadn't spoken, I can make some educated guesses on the basis of what's happened to you before, and you'd have to tell me the details. I couldn't swoop even if I wanted to. I'm not sure I could get it clear even if you shoved it all up to the front of your mind and put out a welcome mat. But when you asked who they were, that little rhyme about the Tommyknockers came up like a big bubble, and it ran itself off on the typewriter. All right, Guard said. Although it wasn't all right. Nothing was all right. But who are they besides the Tommyknockers? Are they pixies? Leprechauns? I asked you to look around because I wanted you to get an idea of how big all of this is, Anderson said. How far-reaching the implications could be. I realize that, all right, Gardner said, and a smile ghosted around the corners of his mouth. A few more far-reaching implications, and I'd be ready for a straight waistcoat. Your Tommyknockers came from space, Anderson said, as I think you must have deduced by now. Gardner supposed the thought had done more than cross his mind, but his mouth was dry and his hands froze around the coffee cup. Are they around? He asked, and his voice seemed to come from afar, far away. He was suddenly afraid to turn around, afraid he might see some gnarled thing with 3 eyes and a horn where its mouth should have been, come waltzing out of the pantry, something that belonged only on a movie screen, maybe in a Star Wars epic. I think they, the actual physical they, have been dead for a long time, Anderson said calmly. They probably died long before men existed on Earth, but then Caruso's dead, but he's still singing on a hell of a lot of records, isn't he? Bobbi, Gardner said, tell me what happened. I want you to begin at the beginning and end by saying, then you came up the road just in time to grab me when I passed out. Can you do that? Not entirely, she said and grinned, but I'll do my best. 8. Anderson talked for a long time. She finished. It was past noon. Guard sat across the kitchen table, smoking, excusing himself only once to go into the bathroom, where he took 3 more aspirin. Anderson began with her stumble, told of coming back and digging out more of the ship, enough to realize she had found something utterly unique, and then going back a 3rd time. She did not tell Gardner about Chuck the woodchuck, who had been dead but not fly-blown, nor about Peter's shrinking cataract, nor about the visit to Etheridge the vet. She passed over those things smoothly, saying only that when she came back from her first whole day of work on the thing, she had found Peter dead on the front porch. It was as if he had gone to sleep, Anderson said, and there was a note of schmaltz in her voice, so unlike the Bobbi he knew that Gardner looked up sharply, and then looked down at his hands quickly. Anderson was crying a little. After a few moments, Gardner said, what then? Then you came up the road just in time to grab me when I passed out, Anderson said, smiling. I don't understand what you mean. Peter died on the 28th of June, Anderson said. She had never had much practice as a liar, but thought this came out sounding smooth and natural. It's the last day I remember clearly, sequentially, till you showed up last night, that is. She smiled openly and guilelessly at Gardner. But this was also a lie. Her clear, sequential, unjarbled memories ended the day before, on the 27th, and with her standing above the titanic thing buried in the earth, gripping the handle of the shovel, they ended with her whispering, everything's fine, and then beginning to dig. There was more to the tale, all right, all kinds of more. She couldn't remember it sequentially, and what she could remember would have to be edited, carefully edited. For instance, she couldn't really tell Guard about Peter, not yet. They had told her she couldn't. But on that one, she didn't need any telling. They had also told her Jim Gardner would have to be watched very, very closely. Not for long, of course. Soon, Guard would be part of us, on the team, yes. And it would be great to have him on the team. Because if there was anyone in the world Anderson loved, it was Jim Gardner. Bobbi, who are they? Hold on, I want to see where chapter 10 is. We might actually go on to chapter 10, depending. Oh, yeah, I think we're going to continue on to chapter 10 because 9's only got another page and we still have another hour. Tommyknockers. That word which had risen out of the queer opaqueness in Guard's mind, like a silvery bubble, was as good a name as any, wasn't it? Sure, better than some. So what now? Gardner asked, lighting her last cigarette. He looked both dazed and weary. I'm not saying I can swallow all this, he laughed, a bit wildly. Or maybe it's just that my throat's not big enough for it all to go down at once. I understand, Anderson said. I think the main reason I remember so little about the past week or so is that it's all so weird. Like having your mind strapped to a rocket sled. She didn't like lying to Guard. It made her uneasy, but all the lying would be done soon enough. Guard would be, well, persuaded. When he saw the ship, when he felt the ship, no matter how much I do or don't believe, I'm forced to believe most of it, I guess. When you remove the impossible, whatever remains is the truth, no matter how improbable. You got that too, did you? The shape of it. It might not have even known. The shape of it. I might not have even known what it was if I hadn't heard you say it once or twice. Gardner nodded. Well, I guess it fits the situation we have here. If I don't believe the evidence of my senses, I have to believe I'm crazy. Although God knows there are enough people in the world who would be more than happy to testify, that's just what I am. You're not crazy, Guard, Anderson said quietly, and put her hand over his. He turned his own over and squeezed it. Well, a man who shot his wife. There are people who'd say that's pretty persuasive evidence of insanity. Guard, that was 8 years ago. Sure. And the guy I elbowed in the tit, that was 8 days ago. I also chased a guy down Arberg's hall and across his dining room with an umbrella. Did I tell you that? My behavior over the last 5 years has been increasingly self-destructive. Hi, folks, and welcome once more to the National Self-Pity Hour, Bobbi Anderson chirruped brightly. Tonight's guest is... I was going to kill myself yesterday morning, Gardner said quietly. If I hadn't gotten the idea, really strong idea, that you were in trouble, I'd be fish food now. Anderson looked at him closely. Her hand slowly tightened down on his until it was hurting. You mean it, don't you? Christ! Sure. You want to know how bad it's gotten? It seemed like the sanest thing I could do under the circumstances. Come off it. I'm serious. Then this idea came, the idea that you were in trouble. So I put it off long enough to call you, but you weren't here. I was probably in the woods, Anderson said, and you came running. She shifted his hand to her mouth and kissed it gently. If this whole crazy business doesn't mean anything else, at least it means you're still alive, you asshole. As always, I'm impressed by the almost Gaelic range of your compliments, Bobbi. If you ever do it, I'll see it's written on your tombstone, Guard. Asshole, in letters carved deep enough so they won't wear off for at least a century. Well, thanks, Gardner said. But you won't have to worry about it for a while, because I still got it. What? That feeling that you're in trouble? She tried to look away, tried to take her hand away. Look at me, Bobbi, God damn it. At least, reluctantly, she did. Her lower lip slightly pushed out in that stubborn expression he knew so well. But didn't she also look just the tiniest bit uneasy? He thought so. All of this seems so wonderful. House powered from D cells, books that write themselves, God knows what else. So why should I feel that you're in trouble? I don't know, she said softly, and got up to do the dishes. 9. Of course I worked until I damn near dropped. That's one thing, Anderson said, her back to him now. And he had a feeling she liked it that way. Fine. Dishes rattled in hot, soapy water. And I didn't just say aliens from space, ho-hum. Cheap, clean electric power and mental telepathy, big deal. My mailman's cheating on his wife. I know about it. I don't want to know about it. Hell, I'm no snoop. But it was just there, Guard. Right there in the front of his head. Not seeing it would be like not seeing a neon sign 100 feet away. Christ, I've been rocking and reeling. I see, he said, and thought, she's not telling the truth, at least not all of it, and I don't think she even knows it. The question remains, what do we do now? I don't know. She glanced around, saw guards, raised eyebrows, and said, did you think I was going to give you the answer in a neat little essay, 500 words or less? Can't. I've got some ideas, but that's all. Maybe not even very good ones. I suppose the first thing is to take you out so you can, he's persuaded, have a look at it. Afterward, well, Gardner looked at her for a long time. Bobbi did not drop her eyes this time. They were open and guileless. But things were wrong here. Off note and off key. Things like that note of fake schmaltz in Bobbi's voice when she spoke of Peter. Maybe the tears had been real. That tone. It had been all wrong. All right, let's go take a look at your ship in the earth. But let's have lunch first, Bobbi said placidly. You're hungry again? Sure, aren't you? Christ, no. Then I'll eat for both of us, Anderson said. And she did. Chapter 10. Part 1, Chapter 10. Gardner decides. 1. Good God! Gardner sat down heavily on the fresh stump. It felt like a case of sit down or fall down, like being punched hard in the stomach. No, it was stranger and more radical than that. It was more like someone had slammed the hose of an industrial vacuum cleaner into his mouth and turned it on, sucking all the wind out of his lungs in a second's time. Good God, he repeated in a tiny, breathless voice. It seemed to be all of which he was capable. It's something, isn't it? They were halfway down the slope, not far from where Anderson had found the dead Chuck. Before the slope had been pretty heavily wooded. Now, a lane had been cut through the trees to admit a strange vehicle which Gardner almost recognized. It stood at the edge of Anderson's dig, and it was dwarfed both by the excavation and by the thing which was being unearthed. The trench was now 200 feet long. That's long. That's like really long. Almost as long as a football field. And 20 feet wide at either end. That's bigger width than my living room. It is long. Wow. The cut bulged to 30 feet or so in depth and width, for perhaps 40 feet of the slit's total length. That bulge made a shape like a woman's hips, seen in silhouette. The gray leading edge of the ship, its curvature now triumphantly revealed, rose out of this bulge like the edge of a giant steel tea saucer. Good God, Gardner gasped again. Look at that thing. I have been, Bobbi said, a distant little smile playing over her lips. For over a week. I've been looking at it. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, and it's going to solve a lot of problems, Guard. There came a man on horseback riding. Horseback, I mean. That cut through the fog. Gardner looked around at Anderson, who might have been drifting in the dark places from which that incredible thing had come. The look on her face chilled Gardner. Bobbi's eyes were not just far off, they were vacant windows. What do you mean? Anderson looked around as if coming out of a deep daze. What do you mean, a man on horseback? I mean you, Guard. I mean me. But I think I mostly mean you. Come on down here and take a look. Anderson started down the slope quickly, with the casual grace of previous experience. She got maybe 20 feet before she realized Gardner wasn't with her. She looked back. He had gotten up from the stump. That was all. It won't bite you, Anderson said. No? What will it do to me, Bobbi? Nothing. They're dead, Guard. Your Tommyknockers were real enough. But They were mortal, and this ship had been here for at least 50 million years. The glacier broke around it. It covered it, but it couldn't move it. Not even all those tons of ice could move it, so the glacier broke around it. You could look into the cut and see it, like a frozen wave. Dr. Borns from the university would go batshit over this, but they're dead enough, Guard. Have you been inside? Gardner asked, not moving. No, the hatch, I feel there is one, but there is one, is still buried. But that doesn't change what I know. They're dead, Guard. Dead. They're dead. You haven't been in the ship, but you're inventing like Thomas Edison on the speed trip, and you can read minds. So I repeat, what is it going to do to me? So she told the biggest lie of all, told it calmly, with no regret at all. She said, nothing, you don't want it to, and started down again, without looking back to see if he was following. Gardner hesitated, his head throbbing miserably, and then he started down after her. 2. The vehicle by the trench was Bobbi's old truck. Only before that it had been a country squire station wagon. Anderson had driven it from New York when she came to college. That had been 13 years ago, and it had not been new then. She had run it on the road until 84, when even Eld Baker down at the Shell station, Haven's only garage and gas stop, would no longer slap an inspection sticker on it. Then, in one weekend of frenzied work, they had been drunk for most of it, and Gardner still thought something of a miracle that they hadn't blown themselves up with Frank Garrick's old blowtorch ring. They had cut off the roof of the station wagon from above the front seat on back, turning it into a half-assed truck. Look at that. Look at that. Guard, old guard, Bobbi Anderson had proclaimed solemnly, staring at the remains of the wagon. We done made ourselves an honest-to-God field bomber. Then she leaned over and threw up. Gardner had picked her up and carried her onto the porch, Peter twinning anxiously around his feet the whole way. By the time he got her there, she had passed out. He had put her down carefully and then passed out himself. The half-assed truck had been a tough old Detroit rod bucket that had finally gone toes up. Anderson had put it on blocks at one end of the garden, claiming no one would want to buy it, even for parts. Gardner thought. She just felt sentimental. Now the truck had been resurrected, although it hardly looked like the same vehicle, except for the blue paint and the remains of the fake wood siding that had been on the one of the country squire's trademarks. I remember those. The driver's door and most of the front end were gone entirely. The latter had been replaced by a weird conglomeration of digging and earth-moving equipment. To Gardner's disturbed eye, Anderson's truck now looked like a deranged child's bulldozer. Something which looked like a giant screwdriver blade protruded from the place where the grill had been. The engine looked like something which had been yanked whole from an old D9 Caterpillar. Bobbi, where did you get that engine? How did you move it from where it was then to where it is now? Good Jesus. Yet all this, remarkable as it was, could hold his eye for only a moment or two. He walked across the ripped earth to where Bobbi was standing, hands in pockets, looking into the slash in the earth. What do you think, guard? He didn't know what he thought, and was speechless anyway. The excavation went down to an amazing depth, 30 or 40 feet, he guessed. If the angle of the sun hadn't been exactly right, he wouldn't have been able to see the bottom of the trench at all. There was a space of about 3 feet between the side of the excavation and the small hull of the ship. The hull was utterly unbroken. There were no numbers, symbols, pictures, or hieroglyphs on it. At the bottom of the cut, the thing disappeared into the earth. Gardner shook his head, opened his mouth, found he still had no words, and shut it again. The part of the hull Anderson had first tripped over and then tried to wiggle with her hand, thinking it might be a tin can left over from Loggers' Weekend, was now directly in front of Gardner's nose. He could easily have reached across a 3-foot space and grasped it as Anderson herself had just 2 weeks ago. With this difference, when Anderson first grasped the edge of the ship in the earth, she had been on her knees. Gardner was standing. He had vaguely noted the going over this slope had taken rough, muddy terrain. Trees that had been cut and moved aside, stumps that had been pulled like rotten teeth. But beyond that momentary observation, he had dismissed it. He would have taken a closer look if Anderson had told him how much of the slope he had simply cut away. The hill had made the thing harder to get out. So, she had simply removed half the hillside to make it easier. Flying saucer, Bart thought faintly, and then, I did jump. This is a death fantasy. Any second now, I'm coming to and find myself trying to breathe salt water. Any second now, just any old second. Except that nothing of the sort did or would happen, because all of this was real. It was a flying saucer. And that, somehow, was the worst. Not a spaceship, not an alien craft, or an extraterrestrial vehicle. It was a flying saucer. They had been debunked by the Air Force, and by thinking scientists, by psychologists. No self-respecting science fiction writer would put one in his story. If he did, no self-respecting editor would touch it with a 10-foot pole. Flying saucers had gone out of vogue in the genre at roughly the same time as Edgar Rice Burroughs and Otis Adelbert Klein was the oldest wheeze in the book. Flying saucers were more than passé. The idea itself was a joke, given mental house room these days only by crackpots, religious eccentrics, and of course the tabloid newspapers, where any week's budget of news had to include at least one saucer story, such as 6-year-old pregnant by saucer alien, fearful mother reveals. These stories, for some old reason, all seemed to originate in either Brazil or New Hampshire. And yet, here was such a thing. It had been here all the while. Centuries passed above it like minutes. A line from Genesis suddenly occurred to him, making him shiver as if cold wind had blown past. These were the giants and the earth in those days. He turned toward Anderson, his eyes almost pleading. Is it real? He could no more than whisper. Well, it's real. Touch it. She knocked on it, producing a dull fist on mahogany sound again. Gardner reached out, then pulled his hand back. A look of annoyance passed over Anderson's face like a shadow. I told you, Guard, it won't bite you. It won't do anything to me I don't want it to? Absolutely not, Gardner reflected. As much as he was able to reflect in his current state of roaring confusion, that he had once believed that about booze. Come to think of it, he had heard people, most of them his college students in the early 70s, say the same thing about various drugs. Many of them had ended up in clinics or drug counseling sessions with severe nose candy problems. Tell me, Bobbi, did you want to work until you dropped? Did you want to lose so much weight that you looked like an anorexic? I guess all I really want to know is, did you drive or was you driven? Why did you lie about Peter? Why don't I hear birds in the woods? Go on, Anderson said patiently. We've got some talking to do. and some hard decisions to make. And I don't want you breaking in halfway through to say you decided the whole thing was just a hallucination that came out of a liquor bottle. Well, that's a shitty thing to say. So are most of the things people really have to say. You've had the DTs before. You know it. And so do I. Yeah, but the old Bobbi never would have brought it up. Or at least, not in that way. You touch it, you'll believe it. That's all I'm saying. You make it sound important to you. Anderson shifted her feet restlessly. All right, Gardner said. All right, Bobbi. He reached out and grasped the edge of the ship, much as Anderson had the first day. He was aware, too aware, that an expression of naked eagerness had spread over Bobbi's face. It was the face of a someone who was waiting for a firecracker to go off. Several things happened almost simultaneously. The first was a sense of vibration settling into his hand. The sort of vibration one might feel when one lays a hand on a power pole carrying high voltage wires. For a moment, it seemed to numb his flesh, as if the vibration was moving at an incredibly high speed. Then the feeling was gone. As it went, Gardner's head filled with music. But it was so loud that it was more like a scream than music. It made what he had heard the night before sound like a whisper in comparison. It was like being inside a stereo speaker turned all the way up. Daytime turns me off, and I don't mean maybe. 9 to 5 ain't taking me where I'm bound. When it's done, I come home to... He was opening his mouth to scream when it cut off, all at once. Gardner knew the song, which had been popular when he was in grade school, and later he sang the snatch of lyrics he had heard, looking at his watch as he did so. The sequence seemed to have been a second or two of high-speed vibration, a burst of ear-splitting music, which had lasted roughly 12 seconds. Then the bloody nose. Except ear-splitting was wrong. It had been head-splitting. It had never come through his ears at all. It arrowed into his head from that damned piece of steel in his forehead. He saw Anderson go staggering backward, her hands threw out in what seemed like a warding-off gesture. Her look of eagerness became one of surprised fear, bewilderment, and pain. The last thing was that his headache was gone, utterly and completely gone. But his nose was not just bleeding, it was spouting. 3. Here, take it. Christ, Guard, are you all right? Oh, I'll be fine, Guard said, his voice slightly muffled by her handkerchief. He doubled it and settled it over his nose, pressing down firmly on the bridge. He tilted his head up, and the slimy taste of blood began to fill his throat. I've had worse ones than this. So he had, but not for a long time. They had moved back about 10 paces from the edge of the cut and seated themselves on a felled tree. Bobbi was looking at him anxiously. Christ, Guard, I didn't know anything like that was going to happen. You believe me, don't you? Yes, Guard said. He didn't know precisely what Bobbi had been expecting. Not that. Did you hear the music? I didn't exactly hear it, Anderson said. I got it secondhand from your head. It just about ruptured me, did it? Yeah, Bobbi laughed a little shakily. When I'm around a lot of people, I turn them off. You can do that? He took the handkerchief from his nose. It was sopped with blood. Gardner could have twisted it between his fingers and wrung blood out of it in a gory little stream. But the flow was finally slowing down. Thank God. He dropped the handkerchief and tore the tail off his shirt. Yes, Anderson said. Well, not entirely. I can't turn the thoughts completely off, but I can dial them way down. So it's like a faint whisper at the bottom of my mind. That's incredible. That's necessary, Anderson said grimly. If I couldn't, I don't think I'd ever leave this goddamn house again. I was in Augusta on Saturday, and I opened my mind up to see what it'd be like. And you found out? Yeah, I found out. It was like having a hurricane in your head. And the scary thing was how hard it was get the door shut again. The door, barrier, whatever. How do you put it up? How do you put it up? Anderson shook her head. Can't explain. Any more than a guy who can wiggle his ears can explain how he does it. She cleared her throat and looked down at her shoes for a moment. Muddy work boots, Gardner saw. They looked as if they'd been off her feet, hadn't been off her feet much in the last couple of weeks. Bobbi grinned a little. The grin was embarrassed and painfully humorous at the same time. And in that moment, she looked completely like the old Bobbi, the one who had been his friend after nobody else wanted to be. It was Bobbi's aw shucks look. Gardner had seen it the very first time he met her, when Bobbi was a freshman English student and Gardner a freshman English instructor. Banging apathetically away at a PhD thesis he probably knew, even then, he was never going to finish. Hungover and feeling bilious. Gardner had asked the class of new freshmen what the dative case was. No one offered an answer. Gardner had been about to take great pleasure in blowing them all out of the water when Anderson, Roberta, row 5, seat 3, raised her hand, took a shot at it. Her answer was different, but correct. Not surprisingly, she turned out to be the only one of them who'd had Latin in high school. Same aw shucks grin he was seeing now had been on Bobbi's face then. And Gard felt a wave of affection sweep over him. Shit. Bobbi had been through a tough time. But this was Bobbi. Question about it. I keep the barriers up most of the time anyway, she was saying. Otherwise, it's like peeking in windows. Remember me telling you my mailman Paulson has got something going on the side? Gardner nodded. That isn't anything I want to know. Or if some poor slop is a klepto, or if some guy's a secret drinker. How's your nose? Bleeding stopped. Gardner put down the bloody piece of shirting beside Bobbi's handkerchief. So, you keep the blocks up? Yes. For whatever reasons, moral, ethical, or just to keep from going batshit with the noise, I keep them up. With you, I let them down because I wasn't getting squat, even when I tried. I did try a couple of times, and if that makes you mad, I understand. But it was only curiosity because no one else is blank like that. No one? Nope. There must be some reason for it. Something like having a really rare blood type. Maybe that even is it. Sorry, a typo. Anderson laughed and got up. You feel up to going back, Guard? It's the plate in my head, Bobbi. He almost said it, and then, for some reason, decided not to. The plate in my head is keeping you out. I don't know how. I know that. How I know that, but I do. Yeah, I'm fine, he said. I could use a drink. A cup of coffee, that's all. You got it. Come on. 4. While part of her had been reacting to Guard with the warmth and genuine good feeling she had always felt for him, even during the worst times. Another part of her, a part that was not, strictly speaking, Bobbi Anderson at all anymore, had stood coldly off to one side. My hair fell down. Yep. Watching everything carefully, assessing, questioning. And the first question was whether she really wanted Gardner around at all. They, had thought, at first, that all her problems would now be solved. Gard would join her on the dig. She would no longer have to do this first part, all alone. He was right about one thing. Trying to do it all by herself had nearly killed her. But the change she had expected in him hadn't happened. Only that distressing nosebleed. He wouldn't touch it again if it makes his nose bleed like that. He won't touch it, and he certainly won't go inside it. It may not come to that, after all. Peter never touched it. Peter didn't want to go near it. But his eye, and the age reversal. It's not the same. He's a man, not an old beagle dog. But face it, Bobbi, except for the nosebleed and that blast of music, there was absolutely no change. No immediate change. Is it the steel plate in his skull? Maybe. But why should something like that make any difference? That cold part of Bobbi didn't know. She only knew that it could have. The ship itself broadcast some kind of tremendous, almost animate force. Whatever had come in it was dead. She was sure she hadn't lied about that. The ship itself was almost alive, broadcasting that enormous energy pattern through its metal skin. And she knew the broadcast area widened its umbrella a little every inch of its surface she dug free. That energy had communicated itself to Guard, but then it had, what, been converted somehow? First converted and then blown off in a short, furiously powerful radio transmission? What do I do? She didn't know. But she knew it didn't matter. They would tell her. When the time came, they would tell her. In the meantime, he would bear watching. But if only she could read him. It would be so much simpler if she could fucking read him. A voice responded coldly. Get him drunk. Then you'll be able to read him. Then you'll be able to read him just fine. 5. They had come out on the Tomcat, which did not fly at all, but rolled along the ground just as it always had. But instead of the former racket and roar of its engine, it now rolled in a complete silence that was somehow ghastly. They came out of the woods and bumped along the edge of the garden. Anderson parked the Tomcat where it had been that morning. Gardner glanced up at the sky, which was beginning to cloud over again, and said, You better put it in the shed, Bobbi. It'll be all right, she said shortly. She pocketed the key and started toward the house. Gardner glanced towards the shed, started after Bobbi, then looked back. There was a big Craig padlock on the shed door. Another new addition. The woods, should pardon the pun, seemed to be full of them. What have you got in there? Time machine that runs on pen lights? What's the new improved Bobbi got in there? 6. When he came into the house, Bobbi was rummaging in the fridge. She came up with a couple of beers. Were you serious about coffee, or do you want one of these? How about a Coke? Gardner asked. Flying saucers go better with Coke. That's my motto. He laughed rather wildly. Sure, Bobbi said, then stopped in the act of returning the cans of beer and grabbing 2 cans of Coke. I did, didn't I? Huh? I took you out there and showed it to you, the ship, didn't I? Jesus, Gardner thought. Jesus Christ. For a moment, standing there with the bottles in her hands, she looked like someone with Alzheimer's disease. Yes, Gardner said, feeling his skin grow cold. You did. Good, Bobbi said, relieved. I thought I did. Bobbi, are you all right? Sure, Anderson said, and then added offhandedly, as if it were a thing with little or no importance. It's just that I can't remember much of when we left the house until now. But I guess it doesn't really matter, does it? Here's your Coke, Guard. Let's drink to life on other worlds. What do you say? Wow, this is a long chapter, isn't it? That's okay. 7. So they drank to other worlds, and then Anderson asked him what they should do with the spaceship she had stumbled on in the woods behind her house. We're not going to do anything. You're going to do something. I already am, Guard, she said gently. Of course you are, he said a little testily. But I'm not talking about some final disposition. I'll be happy to give you all the advice you want. Us drunken, broken down poets are great at giving advice. But in the end, you're going to do something. Something a little more far-reaching than just digging it up. Because it's yours. It's down on your land and it's yours. Anderson looked shocked. You don't really think that thing belongs to anyone, do you? Why, because Uncle Frank left me this place in his will? Because he had a clear title going back to part of the crown parcel that King George III swiped from the French after the French had swept it from the Indians? Good Christ, Guard, that thing was 50 million years old when the forebears of the whole damned human race were squatting on their hunkers in caves and picking their noses. I'm sure that's very true, Guard said dryly, but it doesn't change the law. And anyway, are you going to sit there and try to tell me you're not possessive of it? Anderson looked both upset and thoughtful. Possessive? No, I wouldn't say that. It's responsibility. I feel not possessiveness. Well, whatever. But since you asked my opinion, I'll give it to you. Call Limestone Air Force Base. Tell whoever answers that you've found an unidentified object down in your land that looks like an advanced flying machine of some sort. You might have some trouble at first, but you'll convince them. Then Bobbi Anderson laughed. She laughed long and hard and loud. It was genuine laughter, and there was nothing meant about it, and it made Gardner feel acutely uncomfortable all the same. She laughed till tears streamed down her face. He felt himself stiffening. I'm sorry, she said, seeing his expression. It's just that I can't believe I'm hearing this from you. Of all people. It's just... She snorted laughter again. Well, it's a shock. Like having a Baptist preacher advise drinking as a cure for lust. I don't understand what you mean. Sure you do. I'm listening to the guy who got arrested at Seabrook with a gun in his pack. The guy who thinks the government won't really be happy until we all glow in the dark like radium watches. Tell me to just call up the Air Force so they can come down here and take charge of the interstellar spacecraft. What's your land? Shit, Guard, my land is as vulnerable to the U.S. government's right of eminent domain as anyone else's. Eminent domain's what gets turnpikes built, and sometimes nuclear reactors. Bobbi sat down again and looked at Guard in level silence. Think about what you're saying, she said softly. 3 days after I made a call like that, neither the land nor the ship would be mine any more. 6 days after, they'd have barbed wire strung around the whole place and sentries posted every 50 feet. 6 weeks after, I think you'd probably find 80% of Haven's population brought out, kicked out, or simply lost. They could do it, Guard. You know they could. What it comes down to is this. You want me to pick up the phone and call the Dallas police. Bobbi. Yes, that's what it boils down to. I found an alien spacecraft and you want me to turn it over to the Dallas police. Do you think they're going to come down here and say, please come to Washington with us, Miss Anderson? The Joint Chiefs of Staff are very anxious to hear about your ideas on this matter. Not only because you used to own, the land the thing is on, but because the Joint Chiefs actually poll the Western writers before they decide what they should do about such things. Also, the president wants you to pop around to the White House so he can get your thinking. In addition, he wants to tell you how much he liked Rimfire Christmas. Anderson threw back her head, and this time the laughter she uttered was wild, hysterical, and quite creepy. Gardner barely noticed. Did he really think they were going to come down here and be polite? With something as potentially enormous as this on the line? The answer was no. They would take the land. They would gag him and Bobbi. But even that might not be enough to make them feel comfortable. Could be they'd wind up someplace like a weird cross between a Russian gulag and a posh club med resort. All the beads are free, and the only catch is you never get out. Or even that might not be enough. So, mourners, please admit flowers. Then and only then could the ship's new caretaker sleep easy at night. After all, it wasn't exactly an aircraft, like an Etruscan vase or Manet balls dug out of the ground at the site of some long-ago Civil War battle, was it? The woman who had found it had subsequently managed to power her entire house on these cells. And he was not ready to believe that, even if the new gear on the Tomcat didn't work yet. It soon would. And what exactly would make it work? Microchips? Semiconductors? No. Bobbi's extra added ingredient. The new improved Bobbi Anderson. Bobbi. Or maybe it was anybody who got close to the thing. And the thing like that, well, You couldn't let an ordinary private citizen hold on to it. Now could you? Whatever else is it, he muttered. The goddamn thing must be one hell of a brain booster. Turns you into a genius. No, an idiot savant, Anderson said quietly. What? Idiot savant. I'll have to answer that later. They got maybe half a dozen of them down in Pineland. Pineland, that's the state facility for the severely retarded. I was there for 2 summers on a work-study program while I was in college. There was a guy who could multiply 2 6-digit numbers in his head and give you the correct answer in less than 5 seconds. But he was just as apt to piss in his pants while he was doing it as not. There was a 12-year-old kid who was hydrocephalic. His head was as big as the prize pumpkin, but he could set perfectly justified type at the rate of 160 words a minute. Couldn't talk, couldn't read, couldn't think, but he set type like a hurricane. Anderson pawed a cigarette out of the pack and lit it. Now wait, he smoked the last one. She must have got a new pack. Her eyes looked steadily at Gardner out of her thin, haggard face. That's what I am. An idiot savant. That's all I am. And they'd know it. Those things, customizing the typewriter, fixing the water heater, I only remember them in bits and pieces. While I'm doing them, everything seems as clear as a bell. But later, she looked pleadingly at Gardner. You get it? Gardner nodded. I'm coming from the ship. It's coming from the ship, like radio transmissions from a broadcast tower. Just because the radio can pick up transmissions and send them to the human ear. It's not talking. The government would be happy to take me, lock me up somewhere, and then to cut me up into little pieces to see if there had been any physical changes, just as soon as my unfortunate accident gave them a reason to do an autopsy, that is. Are you sure you're not reading my mind, Bobbi? No, but do you really think they'd scruple at wasting some people over a thing like this? Gardner slowly shook his head. So taking your advice would amount to this, Anderson said. First, call the Dallas police, then get taken into custody by the Dallas police, and then be killed by the Dallas police. Gardner looked at her troubled and then said, All right, I cry uncle. What's the alternative? You have to do something. Christ, that thing is killing you. What? You've lost 30 pounds. How's that for a start? Anderson looked startled and uneasy. No, Guard, no way. 15, maybe. But I was getting love handles anyway, and... Go weigh yourself, Gardner said. You can get the needle over 95. Even with your boots on. I'll eat the scale. Lose a few more pounds and you'll get sick. The state you're in. You could go into heartbeat arrhythmia and die in 2 days. I needed to lose some weight, and I was too busy to eat. Was that what you were going to say? Well, not exactly in those words. When I saw you last night, you looked like a survivor of a Bataan death mark. You knew who I was. That was all you knew. You're still not tracking. 5 minutes after we got back in here, from looking at your admittedly amazing find, you were asking me if you'd taken me to see it yet. Bobbi's eyes were still on the table, but he could see her expression. It was set and sullen. He touched her gently. All I'm saying is that no matter how wonderful the thing in the woods is, it's doing things to your body and mind that have been terrible for you. Bobbi drew away from him. You're saying I'm crazy. No, I'm not saying you're crazy, for God's sake. But you could get crazy if you don't slow down. Do you deny that you've been having blackouts? You're cross-examining me, Guard? And for a woman who has been asking my advice 15 minutes ago, you're being a pretty fucking hostile witness. They glared at each other across the table for a moment. Anderson gave first. Blackouts aren't the right word. Don't try to equate what's happening to you when you drink too much, with what's happening to me. They're not the same. I'm not going to argue Semetics with you, Bobbi. That's a sidetrack and you know it. The thing out there is dangerous. That's what seems important to me. Anderson looked up at him. Her face was unreadable. You think it is? She said, the words making neither a question nor a declarative sentence. It came out perfectly flat and inflectionless. You haven't just been getting or receiving ideas, Gardner said. You've been driven. Driven? Anderson's expression did not change. Gardner rubbed at his forehead. Driven, yes. Driven the way a bad, stupid man will drive a horse until it drops dead in the traces, then stand over it and whip the carcass until the damned nag had the nerve to die. A man like that is dangerous to horses, and whatever there is in that ship. I think it's dangerous to Bobbi Anderson. If I hadn't showed up. What? If you hadn't shown up, what? I think you'd still be at it right now, working day and night, not eating, and that by this coming weekend, you'd have been dead. I think not, Bobbi said coolly. And just for the sake of argument, let's say you're right. I'm on track again now. You're not on track again, and you're not all right. That mulish look was back on her face. That look which said Guard was talking trash Bobbi would just as soon not hear. Look, Guard said. I'm with you on one last thing. I'm with you on at least one thing. All the way. This is the biggest, most important, utterly mind-blowing thing that's ever happened. When it comes out, the headlines in the New York Times are going to make it look like the National Enquirer. People are going to change their fucking religions over this. You know that? Yes. This isn't a power keg. It's an A-bomb. You know that? Yes, Anderson said again. Then get that pissed look off your face. If we're going to talk about it, let's fucking talk about it. Anderson sighed. Yeah, okay, sorry. I admit I was wrong about calling the Air Force. They spoke together and then laughed together. And that was good. Still smiling, Guard said, something has to be done. I'll buy that, Anderson said. But Bobbi, Jesus, I flunked chemistry and barely got through funny book physics. I don't know exactly, but I do know it's got to be, well, stamped out or something. We need some experts. That's right, Gardner said, seizing on it. Experts. Guard, all the experts work for the Dallas police. Gardner threw his hands up in disgust. Now that you're here, I'll be all right. I know it. It's more likely to go the other way. Next thing, I'll start having blackouts, Anderson said. I think the risk might be worth it. You decided already, haven't you? I decided what I want to do, yeah. What I want to do is keep quiet about it and finish the dig. Digging it all the way out shouldn't even be necessary. I think that once we, I hope, can free it to a depth of maybe 40 or 50 feet, we could come to a hatchway. If we can get inside, Bobbi's eyes gleamed and Gardner felt an answering excitement rise in his own chest at the thought. All the doubts in the world could not hold back that excitement. If we get inside, Gardner repeated. If we get inside, we could get at the controls. And if we can do that, I'm going to fly that fucker right out of the ground. You think you can do that? I know I can. And then? Then I don't know, Bobbi said, shrugging. It was the best, most efficient lie she had told so far. Gardner thought it was a lie. The next thing will happen. That's all I know. But you say it's my decision to make? Yes, I do. As far as the outside world goes, all I can do is continue to not tell. If you decide you will, well, what could I do to stop you? Shoot you with Uncle Frank's shotgun? I couldn't. Make a character in one of my books could. Maybe a character in one of my books could, but I couldn't. This, unfortunately, is real life, where there are no real answers. I guess in real life, I'd just stand here watching you go. But whoever you called, Guard, scientists from the university up in Orono, biologists from Jennings Labs, physicists from MIT, whoever you called, it would turn out you'd actually call the Dallas police. You'd have people coming in here with trucks full of barbed wire and men with guns. She smiled a little. At least I wouldn't have to go to that police state club med alone. No? No. You're in it now, too. When they flew me out there, you'd be right beside me in the next seat. The wan smile broadened, and there still wasn't much humor in it. Welcome to the monkey house, my friend. Aren't you glad you came? Charmed, Gardner said. Suddenly, they were both laughing. How many did it say it had? We'll see. We got 20 minutes, and we'll see how far we get. 8. When the laughter paused, Gardner found that the atmosphere in Bobby's kitchen had eased considerably. Anderson said, "What do you think would happen if the ship if the Dallas police got a hold of it?" "Have you ever heard of a Hangar 18? Guard asked. "No. According to the stories, Hangar 18 is supposed to be part of the Air Force base outside of Dayton, or Dearborn, or anywhere USA. It's where they're supposed to have the bodies of about 5 little men with fishy faces and gills on their necks. Saucerians. It's just one of those stories you hear. Like how somebody found a rat head in his fast food burger, or how there are alligators in the New York sewers. Only now, I sort of wonder if it is a fairy tale. But I think that would be the end. Can I tell you one of those modern fairy tales, Guard? Lay it on me. Have you ever heard the one, she asked, about the guy who invented a pill to take the place of gasoline?" 9. The sun was going down, and the bright blaze of reds, yellows, and purples. Gardner sat on the big stump in Bobbi Anderson's backyard, watching it go. They had talked most of the afternoon, sometimes discussing, sometimes reasoning, sometimes arguing. Bobbi had ended the palaver by declaring herself ravenous again. She made a huge pot of spaghetti and boiled thick pork chops. Gardner had followed her out into the kitchen, wanting to reopen the discussion. Thoughts were rolling around in his mind like balls on a pool table. Anderson wouldn't allow it. She offered Gardner a drink, which Gardner, after a long, thoughtful pause, took. The whiskey went down good and felt good. But he seemed to have no need for a second. Well, no great need. Now sitting here, full of food and drink and looking at the sky, he supposed Bobbi had been right. They'd done all the constructive talking there was to do. It was decision time. Bobbi had eaten a tremendous supper. "You're going to puke, Bobbi," Gardner said. He was serious, but still couldn't help laughing. "Nope," Bobbi said placidly. "Never felt better." She burped. "In Portugal, that's a compliment to the cook. And after a good lay," Gardner lifted one leg and broke wind. Bobbi laughed gustily. "They did the dishes. Haven't invented anything to do this yet, Bobbi. It'll come. Give me time." And then they went into the small, drab living room, which hadn't changed much since the time of Bobbi's uncle, to watch the evening news. None of it was very good. The Middle East was smoldering again, with Israeli flying airstrikes against Syrian ground forces in Lebanon, and hitting a school by accident. Gardner winced at the pictures of burned, screaming children, and Russians driving against the mountain strongholds, and of Afghan rebels, a coup in South America. I don't even know what kind of disclaimer to put for that one. In Washington, the NRC had issued a list of 90 nuclear facilities in 37 states, which safety problems ranging from moderate to serious. Moderate to serious. Great, Gardner thought, feeling the old impotent rage stir and twist, biting into him like acid. If we lose Topeka, that's moderate. If we lose New York, that's serious. He became aware that Bobbi was looking at him a little sadly. "The beat goes on, right?" she said. "Right." When the news was over, Gardner told Anderson she was going to bed. 7:30? I'm still bushed. and she looked at it. Okay, I'll sack out myself pretty soon. I'm tired too. It's been a crazy couple of days. But I'm not completely sure I'd sleep, the way this stuff is whizzing around in my head. You want a Valium? He smiled. I saw they were still here. I'll pass. You were the one who could have used a trank or two last couple of weeks. Data Main's price was going along with Nora's decision not to press charges was that Gardner should go into a counseling program. The program had lasted 6 months. The Valium was probably going to go on forever. Gardner hadn't actually taken any in almost 3 years, but every now and then, usually when he was going traveling, he filled the prescription. Otherwise, some computer might burp up his name and a psychologist picking up a few extra bucks courtesy of the state of Maine might drop by to make sure his head was staying shrunk high to its suitable size. After she was in bed, Gardner turned off the TV and sat a while in Bobby's rocker, reading the Buffalo Soldiers. In a short time, he heard her snoring away. Gardner supposed Bobby's snores would also be part of a conspiracy to keep him awake. But he didn't really mind. Bobby had always snored, the price of a deviated septum, and that had always annoyed Gardner. But he had discovered last night that some of things were worse. The ghastly silence in which she had slept on the couch, for instance. That was much worse. Be nice. Gardner had poked his head in for a moment, had seen Bobby in a much more typical Bobbi Anderson sleeping posture, naked except for pajama bottoms, small breasts.
Money, right?
I didn't say money.
You said neck.
No, I'm reading.
Yeah, not that.
I said naked.
It's a rhyme thing.
Blankets kicked into disarray between her legs, one hand curled under her cheek, the other by her face, her thumb almost in her mouth. Bobby was okay. Sir Gardner had come out here to make his decision. Bobby's patch of garden was going great guns. The corn was taller than any Gardner had seen on his way north. From Arcadia Beach. And her tomatoes were going to be blue ribbon winners. Some of them would have come to the chest of a man walking down the row. In the middle of it all was a cluster of giant sunflowers, ominous as triffids, nodding in the slight breeze. When Bobby asked him earlier if he'd ever heard of the so-called gasoline pill, Gardner had smiled and nodded. More 20th century fairy tales, all right. She then asked him if he believed it. Gardner, still smiling, said no. Bobby reminded him about Hangar 18. Are you saying you do believe there's such a pill? Or was? Something you just drop into your gas tank and run on all day? No, Bobby said quietly. Nothing I've ever read suggests the possibility of such a pill. She leaned forward, forearms on her thighs. But I'll tell you what I do believe. If there was, it wouldn't be on the market. Some big cartel or maybe the government itself would buy it or steal it. Yeah, Art said. He had thought more than once about the crazy ironies inherent in every status quo. Open the U.S. borders and put all customs peoples out of work. Legalize dope and destroy the DEA. No. What?
I was going to show you the image, but I can wait.
And I told you, when I'm reading, I do not look at my phone unless it's important, and photos can wait. Unless it's of you bleeding and dying, it can wait. So you standing here trying to get my attention while I'm reading is not going to do any good except for to make me read longer. Okay? I will look at it when I'm done, and you know that. If I don't look right away, he gets upset. And I'm teaching him patience. Open the U.S. borders and put all those customs people out of work. Legalize dope and destroy the DEA. You might as well try to shoot a man in the moon with a BB gun. Guard burst out laughing. Bobbi looked at him, puzzled, but also smiling a little. So, chair? I was just thinking that if there was a pill like that, the Dallas police would shoot the guy who invented it and then put it next to the green guys in Hangar 18. Not to mention his whole family, Bobbi agreed. Guard didn't laugh this time. This time, it didn't seem quite so hilarious. In that light, Anderson had said, "Look at what I've done here. I'm not even a good handyman, let alone anyone's scientist. So the force that worked through me produced a bunch of stuff that looks more like stuff from boys' life plans than anything else. Built by a fairly incompetent boy at that. They work," Gardner replied. Yes, Anderson had agreed. They did. She even had a vague idea of how they worked. On the principle which would be called collapsing molecule fusion. It was non-atomic, totally clean. The telepathic typewriter, she said, depended on collapsing molecule fusion for juice. And the actual principle of that one was much different, and she didn't understand it. There was a power pack inside that had begun life as a fuzzbuster, but beyond that, she was blank. You get a bunch of scientists in here from the NSA or the shop, and they'd probably have this stuff down pat in 6 hours, Anderson said. They'd go looking around like somebody just kicked them in the balls, asking each other how the hell they could have missed such elementary concepts for so long. And do you know what would happen next? Gardner thought about it hard, his head down, one hand gripping the can of beer Bobbi had given him, the other gripping his forehead. Suddenly, he was back in the terrible party, listening to Ted the Power Man defend the Iroquois plant, which even now was loading hot rods. If we gave these nuke freaks what they wanted, they'd turn around a month or so later and start whining about not being able to use their blow dryers or found out their Cuisinarts weren't going to work when they wanted to mix up a bunch of macrobiotic food. He saw himself leading Ted the Power Man over to Arberg's buffet. He saw him as clearly as it had happened. If it had just as if it was happening right now. On the table, between the chips and the bowl of raw veggies, was one of Bobbi's contraptions. The batteries were hooked up to a circuit board that was in turn hooked up to the ordinary wall switch, the sort available in any hardware store for $1 or so. Gardner saw himself turning this switch, and suddenly everything on the table, chips, raw veggies, the Lazy Susan with its 5 different kinds of dips, the remains of the cold cuts, and the carcass of the chicken in the ashtrays, the drinks, rose 6 inches into the air and then simply held there, their shadows pooling decorously beneath them on the linen. Ted the Power Man looked at this for a moment, mildly annoyed. Then he swept the contraption off the table. The wires snapped. Batteries rolled hither and yon. Everything fell back on the table with a crash. Glasses spilling, ashtrays overturning and scattering butts. Ted took off his sport coat and covered the remains of the gadget, the way you might cover the corpse of an animal hit and killed in the road. That done, he turned back to his small captive audience and resumed speaking. These people think they can go on having their cake and eating it too forever. These people assume that there is always going to be a fallback position. They were wrong. There is no fallback position. It's simple. Nukes or nothing. Gardner heard himself screaming in a rage that was, for a change, totally sober. What about the thing you just broke? What about that? Ted bent and picked up his sport coat, as gracefully as a magician waving his cape before a bedazzled audience. The floor beneath was bare except for a few potato chips. No sign of the gadget. No sign at all. What about what thing? Ted the Power Man asked, looking straight at Gardner with an expression of sympathy into which a liberal helping of contempt had been mixed. He turned to his audience. Does anyone here see anything? No. They were answering in unison, like children reciting. Arberg, Trisha McCardle, all the rest. Even the young bartender and Ron Cummings were reciting it. No, we don't see anything. We don't see anything at all. Ted, not a thing. You're right, Ted. The nukes are nothing. Ted was smiling. Next thing you know, he'll be telling us that old wheeze about the itty-bitty pill you can put in your gas tank, in your car, and run your car on all day. Ted the Power Man began to laugh, while the others joined in. All of them were laughing at him. Gardner raised his head and turned agonized eyes to Bobbi Anderson. You think they'd, classify all this? Don't you? After a moment, in a very gentle voice, Anderson prompted, Guard? Yes, Gardner said after a long time. For a moment, he was very close to bursting into tears. Yeah, sure. Sure they would. And that's where we're going to pause. Because we've got still this much, and that's going to be probably another half an hour for me. As I've been sitting too long. So, we're going to stop there. But the answer that she wanted was not the answer that she got. So, we shall see how she handles things later. What do you think? I gotta blow my nose. So, I'm gonna let y'all go. I'm gonna go on with my day for a little bit, and I shall talk to you guys tonight. 7 o'clock. We will finish up 10 and go on to, I do believe, the next portion is, we're going to finish up 10 and then go on to part 2 of the book, which will be chapter 1. So, continue going on. All right? I shall see you guys later. Love y'all. Follow if you haven't. Keep up. And we shall talk to you all soon. Bye.